In an earlier lab, we studied electrodynamics, the study of current electricity. In many countries today, current electricity is produced by nuclear power plants. A nuclear power plant uses the energy released from the nucleus of an atom to generate electric current. In this lab, we will look at nuclear energy and nuclear radiation. As always, before beginning any experiment in the laboratory, be sure you are familiar with laboratory safety requirements. For a demonstration of basic lab safety rules, you can watch our video entitled Lab Safety. According to the World Nuclear Association, about 9% of the world's electricity is generated by nuclear power plants, which operate in more than 30 countries. In a nuclear power plant, the heat produced by nuclear fission turns water into steam, which powers electric generators. Nuclear fission is the process in which the nucleus of a radioactive isotope splits into two or more nuclei, with much smaller masses, along with a release of energy. The heart of a nuclear power plant is a nuclear reactor. A nuclear reactor is a large metal container used to initiate and control a nuclear fission reaction. Inside a nuclear reactor are thousands of fuel rods, which are sealed metal tubes containing pellets of a fissionable material, such as uranium-235, along with uranium-238, and other radioactive isotopes. A radioactive isotope is an unstable form of an element that releases radiation to become more stable. When describing radioactive isotopes, physicists often use the nuclear notation of that isotope. The nuclear notation for uranium-235 consists of the chemical symbol U for uranium. The subscript 92 is its atomic number, which tells us how many protons are in its nucleus. The superscript 235 is the mass number, which tells us the total number of protons and neutrons in its nucleus. By subtracting the atomic number from the mass number, we can calculate how many neutrons are in the nucleus of the isotope. In this case, we see that uranium-235 has 143 neutrons. Heat from the nuclear reactor turns water into steam inside a steam generator. The steam is used to spin a turbine, which is connected to an electric generator. The generator produces electricity, which flows through transmission wires to local houses and businesses. Environmentalists consider electric power from a nuclear power plant to be cleaner than electric power from coal or gas-fired power plants. While it is true that a nuclear power plant emits no carbon or other pollutants into the air, there is a slight risk of hazardous nuclear radiation being accidentally released into the environment. Nuclear radiation is the emission of high-energy particles from the nucleus of an atom. Here is how nuclear radiation could be released from a nuclear power plant. The fuel rods of a nuclear power plant are highly radioactive. Normally, those fuel rods are safely shielded by the power plant's containment building. However, nuclear radiation could escape the containment building during a nuclear meltdown. A nuclear meltdown is a severe accident resulting in a loss of containment of nuclear material due to overheating of the reactor. If a nuclear reactor is not cooled properly, the temperature of the reactor could rise as high as 3,000 degrees Celsius. That much heat would cause the reactor walls to melt, and radioactive materials would be released with so much force that they would breach through the walls of the containment building, spewing deadly radioactive gases into the atmosphere. However, Since the first commercial nuclear power plant came online more than 70 years ago, only 3 meltdowns have occurred. Of those meltdowns, only one resulted in lost lives due to exposure to nuclear radiation. Newer reactors are designed with safeguards that greatly reduce the risk that such an accident will ever result in casualties again. So, what is nuclear radiation, and why is it potentially dangerous? Nuclear radiation is the emission of high-energy particles from the nucleus of an atom. Nuclear radiation is potentially dangerous for 2 reasons. First, it is dangerous because it is ionizing. That is, it has sufficient energy to turn atoms into ions. Another reason nuclear radiation is so dangerous is that it has penetrating power. Penetrating power is the ability of radiation to pass through matter. When a person is exposed to some forms of intense ionizing radiation, radiation particles pass through the person's body. As they pass through the person, radiation particles cause atoms in his cells to become ions, which break down the cell structure, causing damage to the skin and other organs. Mild ionizing radiation can cause redness or burns on the skin, like a sunburn. If the radiation is more intense or if exposure is longer, the effects can be much more serious. Severe ionizing radiation can cause cell damage, genetic mutations, cancer, or radiation syndrome. Radiation syndrome is a life-threatening condition that results from short-term exposure to extremely intense forms of ionizing radiation. Radiation syndrome will cause headaches, nausea, vomiting, weakness, hair loss, internal bleeding, and eventually death. So, what causes an isotope to be radioactive? Why are some isotopes radioactive and others are not? An isotope with a stable atomic nucleus, such as silicon-28, has a balanced number of protons and neutrons. Some isotopes, such as uranium-235, are unstable because of their sizes and because their protons and neutrons are not balanced. Stable isotopes are not radioactive, and unstable isotopes are radioactive. An unstable nucleus will try to become more stable by emitting nuclear radiation in the form of alpha radiation, beta radiation, gamma radiation, or a combination of the 3. A nuclear reaction in which the nucleus of a radioactive isotope spontaneously changes into a more stable configuration while emitting a high-energy particle is called radioactive decay. A uranium-235 isotope will try to become more stable by ejecting 2 neutrons and 2 protons from its nucleus. As the neutrons and protons are ejected, they combine to form an alpha particle. An alpha particle is a high-energy subatomic particle consisting of 2 protons and 2 neutrons emitted by radioactive elements called alpha emitters. Since an alpha particle contains the same number of protons and neutrons as a helium-4 isotope, its nuclear notation is the same as helium-4. After an alpha particle has been ejected from the nucleus of a uranium-235 isotope, it has 2 fewer protons and 2 fewer neutrons, so it becomes a new isotope. Each element has a specific number of protons. Since the new isotope has 90 protons, it has become an isotope of the element thorium. The new isotope has 141 neutrons, so its mass number, which is the total number of protons and neutrons in its nucleus, is 231. It has become the isotope thorium-231. Let's examine some of the properties of alpha particles. An alpha particle has no electrons, so it has a charge of +2. Since it is an ion, it has a high ionizing ability. However, since it is a relatively large particle, compared with other forms of nuclear radiation, an alpha particle has low penetrating power. To demonstrate the penetrating power of alpha particles, we will use a radiation detector. The results will be displayed on this monitor. The radiation detector contains a tube filled with an inert gas. When a particle of ionizing radiation enters the tube and strikes a molecule of the gas, the molecule loses electrons to become a positively charged ion. The electrons are attracted to the positive electrode, and the ion is attracted to the negative electrode. This causes an electric circuit to be closed, which causes the detector's speaker to emit a beep. The number of beeps are counted and recorded as a graph on the radiation monitor. Each point on the graph represents the number of counts that occurred during 10-second intervals. To demonstrate the penetrating power of radiation particles, we will use this setup. We will run a series of tests using different materials as radiation shields to see how they block radioactive emissions. The radiation detector will detect radiation particles emitted from a small sample of a radioactive isotope as the particles pass through the radiation shields. We will be testing 6 radiation shields in order of increasing density. Our radiation shields include 3 nonmetals, paper, wood, and plastic, and 3 metals, aluminium, copper, and lead. Materials with greater densities have greater abilities to block radioactive emissions than substances with lower densities. Each series of tests will begin with a control test. A control test is a test performed without variables, which is used as a baseline to compare the data with other tests. For these tests, the variables are the radiation shields. The control test is without variables, so we will not use any radiation shield. The results of each control test will be used to compare the results of the other tests in that series of tests. The first control test will be performed with no shield and no radioactive isotope. Notice that the radiation detector is beeping, and the monitor is recording radiation counts, even though we have no radioactive isotope in place. The nuclear radiation being detected is background radiation. Background radiation is the natural ionizing radiation that is always present in an environment. It comes from 3 sources. Background radiation comes from radioactive isotopes in the soil, water, and air. Trace amounts of radioactive uranium, thorium, and radium exist in soil and water. Radon gas is present in the air. Background radiation also comes from the sun or other stars in the form of cosmic rays. We even have tiny amounts of radioactive isotopes in our bodies. Our food often contains tiny amounts of radioactive isotopes, such as carbon-14 and potassium-40. When we eat food containing radioactive isotopes, we become slightly radioactive. Let's determine the amount of background radiation in the environment of our lab. We have detected an average of 11 counts per minute of background radiation. Our data will be recorded on this table. Since we will not be using any of the radiation shields for the background radiation control test, the rest of the data in this row is not applicable. The radiation detector tells us how many counts of nuclear radiation are being detected, but it does not tell us which kind of radiation is present. However, this information is still helpful. An exposure of 10,000 counts per minute is considered dangerous to a person's health, so a reading of only 11 counts per minute will not pose a health risk. In this lab, we will be testing 3 radioactive isotopes: polonium-210, strontium-90, and cobalt-60. Polonium-210 is an alpha emitter. Strontium-90 is a beta emitter. and cobalt-60 is a gamma emitter. Let's measure the amount of alpha radiation given off by the polonium-210. According to our monitor, the polonium-210 emits an average of 15 counts of alpha particles per minute, which is not many more than background radiation. Earlier, we said that alpha particles have low penetrating power. Let's try one of our radiation shields to demonstrate that fact. We will start with a paper shield and determine how much nuclear radiation penetrates the shield. With the paper shield in place, the number of counts dropped to 11, which is the same as background radiation. Since background radiation is always present, a radiation count of 11 or less indicates that alpha particles have been blocked. This shows that the penetrating power of alpha particles is so low that particles are stopped by a piece of paper, which has the least density of any of our shields. Since denser materials have greater abilities to block alpha particles than materials with lesser densities, any material denser than paper would also block alpha particles, so there is no need to test any other radiation shields. Since their penetrating power is so low, alpha particles can be stopped by human skin, so there is no health risk from external exposure to alpha particles. However, if someone were to swallow an alpha emitter, it could cause serious damage to internal organs. The unstable nuclei of some isotopes, such as the polonium-210 we just discussed, become more stable by emitting alpha particles. Other isotopes become more stable by emitting beta particles. A beta particle is a high-speed, high-energy electron, or positron, emitted from the nucleus of an atom. A beta particle can be beta plus or beta minus. In earlier labs, we discussed how electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom. So, if electrons orbit the nucleus, how can an electron be emitted from the nucleus of an atom? We also explained that subatomic particles include protons, neutrons, and electrons. So, what is a positron? To learn how an electron can be emitted from the nucleus of an atom, and to define a positron, we must take a closer look at subatomic particles. For many years, scientists believed that protons, neutrons, and electrons were the only elementary subatomic particles. However, modern scientists have discovered that protons and neutrons are made up of smaller particles called quarks. As far as we know, an electron cannot be split into smaller particles, but there are other elementary subatomic particles similar to electrons. One of those particles is called a neutrino. A neutrino has the same mass as an electron, but it has no charge. Modern science has also discovered that for each type of elementary subatomic particle, there is a corresponding antiparticle. An antiparticle is a subatomic particle with the same mass as an elementary subatomic particle, but with the opposite charge, or the opposite direction of spin. The antiparticles involved in beta radiation are positrons, antiquarks, and antineutrinos. A positron has the same mass and spin as an electron, but it has the opposite charge. An electron has a negative charge, but a positron has a positive charge. An antiquark has the same mass and spin as a quark, but it has the opposite charge. An antineutrino has the same mass as a neutrino, but it spins in the opposite direction. Like a neutrino, an antineutrino has no charge. How isotopes form beta particles can be demonstrated with isotopes of carbon. The most common isotope of carbon is carbon-12, which is a stable isotope with 6 protons and 6 neutrons in its nucleus. The nucleus of a carbon-12 isotope is stable, so it is not radioactive. Another isotope of carbon is carbon-10. Carbon-10 is a radioactive isotope with an unstable nucleus containing 6 protons and 4 neutrons. The nucleus of a carbon-10 isotope has 2 more protons than neutrons. To make the nucleus more stable, 1 proton splits into 3 quarks, an antiquark, and a positron. The 3 quarks recombine to form a neutron, which is attracted back to the nucleus of the isotope. Since the isotope has lost a proton and gained a neutron, its nucleus now contains 5 protons and 5 neutrons. It has become the isotope boron-10. The antiquark becomes a neutrino, which continues to move away from the nucleus. The positron that was ejected from the nucleus becomes a high-speed beta particle, called a beta plus particle. The nuclear radiation of a beta plus particle is called beta plus radiation. Another radioactive isotope of carbon is carbon-14. The nucleus of a carbon-14 isotope contains 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Carbon-14 also emits a beta particle, but it emits a beta minus particle. A nucleus of a carbon-14 isotope has 2 more neutrons than protons, so a neutron splits into 3 quarks, an antiquark, and an electron. The 3 quarks recombine to form a proton, which is attracted back to the nucleus of the isotope. Since the isotope has lost a proton and gained a neutron, its nucleus now contains 7 protons and 7 neutrons. It has become the isotope nitrogen-14. The antiquark becomes an antineutrino, which continues to move away from the nucleus. The electron that was ejected from the nucleus becomes a high-speed beta particle called a beta minus particle. The nuclear radiation of a beta minus particle is beta minus radiation. Beta particles are much smaller than alpha particles, so they travel much faster, have greater ionizing ability, and they have a higher penetrating power than alpha particles. Let's use a beta emitter to demonstrate the penetrating power of beta particles. The beta emitter we will use is strontium-90. First, we will perform a control test by measuring the amount of beta radiation given off by the strontium-90 with no shield in place. Our test results will be displayed on the monitor. Our sample of strontium-90 emitted an average of 385 counts of beta particles per minute, which is the control value for beta radiation. Now, let's try the paper shield to see what effect it has on beta radiation. With the paper shield in place, the number of counts is 352. It seems that the paper shield has only a slight effect on beta radiation. Wood is denser than paper, so let's see if wood will stop beta particles. With the wood shield in place, the nuclear radiation counts dropped to 20, which is a significant decrease. Next, we try a shield made of a high-density plastic. This is the type of plastic used to make plastic jugs and bottles. With the plastic shield, the count drops slightly more, to 17 counts per minute. Now we will try 3 metal shields to see if they block beta particles. The first metal shield is made of aluminium. Even though this shield is much thinner than the wood or plastic shield, it has a higher density. With the aluminium shield in place, the number of counts is 11 counts per minute, which is the same as the background radiation. Since background radiation is always present, a radiation count of 11 or less indicates that beta particles have been blocked. Denser materials have greater abilities to block radioactive emissions than materials with less density. Since aluminium blocked beta particles, we can expect copper and lead shields to do the same. The radiation count for the copper and lead shields were both 11, which was the same as the aluminium shield. So, we can say that any of our metal shields will block beta particles. The third type of ionizing radiation is gamma radiation. When a radioactive isotope emits an alpha particle, the loss of mass may cause the nucleus to become unstable because its energy no longer balances with its mass. In such cases, the nucleus releases some of the excess energy as gamma radiation. The same thing may happen when a radioactive isotope emits a beta particle. Electromagnetic energy is released in specific quantities called photons. So, gamma radiation is in the form of gamma photons. According to quantum mechanics, gamma photons have a dual nature. They behave like particles, but at the same time, they behave like waves. Gamma radiation is electromagnetic radiation that has a higher frequency, shorter wavelength, and greater energy than any other form of radiation. As a result, gamma radiation has a higher ionizing radiation and greater penetrating power than alpha or beta radiation, which makes gamma radiation the most hazardous type of radiation. Even short-term exposure to intense gamma radiation can cause burns, cell damage, cancer, and radiation syndrome. The gamma emitter we will be using is cobalt-60. This sample is so small that we are safe conducting this experiment, as long as we do not directly touch it. Swallowing even this small amount of a gamma emitter could be fatal, although tiny amounts of cobalt-60 are used to treat cancer. As we did with the polonium-210 and the strontium-90, we need to perform a control test by measuring the number of counts without any shielding. We see that the control value for cobalt-60 is 296 counts per minute, which is lower than the control value for strontium-90, the beta emitter, but higher than the control value for polonium-210, the alpha emitter. The control value for strontium-90 was higher because its decay rate is slower than the other two isotopes. A slower decay rate produces a higher concentration of radioactive emissions. Let's see what effect the paper shield will have on gamma radiation. With the paper shield in place, the average counts remain the same, so the paper has no effect on gamma radiation. Next, we will try the wooden shield and the plastic shield. The wooden shield reduced the number of counts to 289, and the plastic shield reduced the number of counts to 282. Next, we will try the metal shields. The number of counts with the aluminium shield was 114. With the copper shield, the count was 108. We see that the lead shield reduces the number of counts to 77. Our lead shield slows down the radiation count to 77, but even this thickness of lead is insufficient to completely stop gamma photons. To completely stop gamma radiation, a thicker shield is needed. That is why the walls of the containment building of a nuclear power plant are nearly 2 meters thick, made of lead and steel-reinforced concrete. What can we conclude from the data we have collected? We see that alpha particles have high ionizing ability and are stopped by a mere sheet of paper, so they have very low penetrating power. External exposure to alpha radiation is relatively harmless to humans. Beta particles have a higher radiation count per minute, so they have a higher ionizing ability. However, beta particles can be blocked by a thin piece of metal, so they have a low penetrating power. With a high ionizing ability and a low penetrating power, beta radiation can be dangerous at close range. Gamma photons have the highest ionizing ability and the highest penetrating power, so gamma radiation is dangerous at any range. In this lab, we explored the ionizing ability and the penetrating power of 3 radioactive isotopes and experimented with radiation shields made of different materials. This is our final lab video for physical science. We hope you have enjoyed this series and will join us again in the future as we learn more about the wonderful world of science. At this time, proceed with the corresponding activities.